Some questions need to be asked. And that might sound a bit harsh, but I think sometimes we don't realize that when we're choosing to wait to talk, we're actually making a decision to leave our child open to hearing something before we get to it.
Hello and welcome back to the Mothership, the show that brings the issues that matter most to Irish families to the table. I'm Laura Cunningham, and on today's show, we're discussing how to create a sex-positive, period-positive household where no conversation is taboo. And of course, we could not talk about this topic without having the amazing Sarah Sproule. And Sarah, thank you so much for joining us.
It's an honour to be here, Laura.
And from the brilliantly named Banana Sex Ed, it's Anna Keogh.
Thank you.
I've been really looking forward to doing this episode actually because, well, I personally could talk about sex and periods all day, and I do. It's probably 90% of the content of my WhatsApp groups. That wasn't always the case though. I personally grew up in a household where sex was just not discussed at all. I think we were like awkwardly given a book at some point. Even when I got my period, it was a case of like you're ushered towards the bathroom and just, let me know if you have any questions, that kind of buzz. I'd like to think that we've come a long way since then. Certainly if how Gen Z talk about all this stuff online about sex and periods, we have. But Sarah, you'd have a better insight than many into where we're at with this stuff. Are we now like a nation of sex-positive Celts, or do you still see resistance and a bit of awkwardness from Irish families around this subject? I suspect you might.
Hands down, parents want something different than what they had growing up.
Oh, yes.
So there are so many families coming and saying, I want to be open with my child about whether it's a period, whether it's how a baby's made, whether it's, why does your penis have hair on it and mine doesn't, those sort of questions. But the issue is not about what they want, it's about how do they make that happen? Mm-hmm. And it's a skills gap between the vision they have for their kids and the connection their kids will feel with them about sensitive things, and well, how do I say the words, how much do I say, what age do I start, and it's that complexity that is causing so much difficulty at the moment.
Because it wasn't our experience growing up, so we don't really know how to do it.
That's exactly right, and it's not just that we didn't have an experience of what it felt like, we've had a negative experience. Mm-hmm. So if we asked a question, or like I remember when I got my period, I didn't want to tell anyone about it because I was embarrassed. And the reason I was embarrassed is because there was a vacuum of positive, natural role models talking about periods. So
it was hidden from us, wasn't it?
Yes. Mm-hmm. So that means that I stuffed my underwear with new toilet paper, and you know how long that lasts, all of 15 minutes before you start realising. So it's that complexity between not having role models and also then the anxiety about getting it wrong and what other families around us will think if we start having conversations that they're not having in their homes.
Okay. So what is the right age to start talking about all of it? Periods, sex, bodies?
I say whatever age you realise that conversations are important for your kid to hear you have.
Okay.
And so if you are fortunate enough to be like watching this episode, for example, and realising, oh, I've got a newborn and I don't know how to say the word vulva, or I feel awkward when I say the word penis, then you start practising using those words before your kid even realises what you're saying. But if you've got a 4-year-old and you're hearing us talk about the fact that you can talk about sperms and eggs and how they get together from, when a child is 3 or 2.5, then you might be going like, oh, quick. Sooner the better, really, when it comes to conversations about sensitive things. And
are there any particular resources that you would recommend for families, like if they're thinking, oh, I don't even know where to start?
I've got a podcast called Sitting in a Car, and
I love it.
Once a week, I answer a practical question that's coming from a real-life family. So children of any age, we get questions from sort of 15 down to like having a newborn. There is an amazing YouTube channel called amaze.org, which is little cartoons, and they have got everything broken up into different age groups, things for parents, things that you can watch with your kids, things that you can watch on your own. And so I think the important thing is finding resources and then using them regularly rather than just dipping in and saying, okay, I think I know how to do this, because it's our emotions that are the thing that hold us back. Mm-hmm. And by seeing a new way or a more confident way of talking, we need to do that each week to remind our nervous system that, oh, this is normal. There are lots of millions of people out in the world talking about this. I can do that too.
Yeah.
And Sarah, you're always talking about like teaching moments, learning moments, which I think is important too. So like you're talking about the right age. like if a 4-year-old asks a question or watches a movie or sees an ad for something and it brings up the conversation and you have those tools that you're talking about, that skill set and the confidence to do it, then have the conversation then. If it doesn't come up for a while, do you know, like you're saying, kind of apply it to real life situations.
Yeah. So that, I mean, that's from a pretty young age. It should just be part of the vocab. They should understand the body parts, be able to speak about them without feeling awkward. And why would they if you don't? You know, because it's all learned, isn't it, really?
And I think an analogy to draw is that there are other things we do in our parenting that is important for our child's health and well-being that they don't ask us to do.
Yes.
So teaching them to cross the road, making sure they have enough vegetables on their plate, eventually taking them to swimming lessons because we know that's a protective thing for later on in their life. Conversations about bodies and babies and puberty and sex and consent is protective. And so why would we be waiting to give our kids the experience of what those feel
Absolutely.
like?
And when we talk about, you know, sex education, it literally starts from our parents, from at home or your guardians. Then, of course, they go to school. I grew up in the 80s and the 90s and went to a Catholic school, so obviously you can imagine the level of sex education I had, 0. I think we were taught about periods in first year in secondary school, which is a little late, guys. That ship if it hadn't sailed, we certainly knew about the ship. You know, there was nothing you could have taught us at that stage. So, so I've heard you say that sex education is a human right, and I love that, by the way. And it is. I mean, how is something that's such a huge fundamental part of us hidden from us, or, you know, not included in a curriculum from an early age? Now, of course, things have moved on, although I do shudder to think of the schools in Ireland that are still using the Catholic Church's sex education programme. Listen, I mean, each their own, but not for my child, thank you very much. Where are we at with that? I mean, it does start at home, we know that, but, you know, are kids being given enough sex education in school at the moment in Ireland?
I suppose I'm going to have to say no, but it varies so wildly.
That's
like
the thing,
from our
isn't it?
research, like it varies so wildly. So like I would be approached by schools who want to run like a 6-week program with every year that's in the school, and you're like, wow, that's great, but that's 500 young people in the vast amount of teenagers that we have in Ireland, in secondary schools in Ireland. So I suppose there's positives and negatives to sex education in Ireland at the moment. A positive is that they did start to look at the Relationships and Sexuality Education Programme, the RSE programme, and they started to look at a reform for that.
Right.
So that was in 2018. And still nothing has happened.
Nothing happens quickly.
So there was recommendations made. And now look, fair enough, 2020 came and the world stopped. So their priorities changed, but it hasn't been picked back up.
Okay.
So that's something that we need to work on. And both myself and Sarah were a part of that, looking at that reform and making recommendations. But just unfortunately, it's gone down in the list.
It's reassuring to hear that schools are reaching out to you to get extra for the kids, even if it isn't the standard.
Very few schools.
Like it should just be, it shouldn't be an add-on, it should be part of the education, right? Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, so we do have like age-appropriate resources for primary school children to talk to them about sex and bodies and periods and consent. But every time we kind of get somewhere with these type of reforms and making new programs, there seems to be some sort of outcry that we are doing something completely wrong, or that we are going to ruin the innocence of the children of today. So an example of that would be that in the recommendations that were made for this RSE reform was that the primary school programme, that we would mention that children should not be shamed for touching themselves.
Sure.
But some people took this to mean that we were going to go into schools and teach kids to masturbate.
Oh, for God's sake.
So this whole sensational, like this outcry then was, oh my God, you can't teach or talk to our children about that. Which that wasn't the case.
There's so much fear, isn't there?
Yes.
I mean, would you rather your child be completely confused, like most of us were for years, about how they were feeling about things and feeling shameful about it? Like, you actually want that for your child rather than for them to be told, you know what, at some point you might feel a bit like this, and that's okay.
Yeah, and I've had a few DMs recently with someone who's really annoyed with a presentation I'm doing to talk to parents about how to talk to kids about online pornography or explicit content. And the complaint is that you're taking away children's innocence. And the reality of it is we're trying, when we're educating parents about how to talk to about that's quite complex. It's pretty hard to think about your 8-year-old and then imagine any pornographic material you've seen, and you're trying to have a conversation that brings those two together. It just feels completely wrong. But where we're coming from is there is so much online that is you can access by mistake, or that someone in the playground who has a much older sibling will show you because they think it's amazing. And if we don't have conversations that prepare our kids for the fact that those things are out there, they're not for kids, that's not how you learn about bodies, they're a much better way to learn about what your body does and how it can feel. So if we don't prepare our kids, then they're left going like, what the heck is this wild and wacky thing? And how big is that penis? And why doesn't my penis look like it doesn't bear thinking about that there's not an opportunity to prepare children, and also to show them that we actually can talk about anything in our house.
Yes.
And if I'm the first person that says the word porn or pornography or naked people online, then my kid remembers that, and they're like, okay, so someone else says this, but it sounds confusing and it feels weird, but my mum has talked to me about that already, so I'm going to go back and ask a question.
Amazing. And you've kind of put it into context before it comes into their life as well. So it's not this really confusing thing that potentially has really bad messaging in it. They have, the knowledge to know that actually I can be critical about what's happening. Isn't that right? I know you're quite into that, teaching them how to have critical thinking in relation to this stuff. Yeah,
definitely. Like, I think that should be a part of the curriculum across the board, is media literacy and critical thinking. Like, we need to give young people more credit, you know, like they can, like they're not watching every single advert that they see on YouTube and thinking, oh, that's real life. Like they know, you know. And when it comes to influencers and any other content that they're consuming, they're very smart, you know. So why not ask them to apply that street smart or those tools to sexual content?
Yeah, absolutely. Guys, can we talk about periods for a minute? One of my favourite topics. So it's quite, there's a lot going on in the media at the moment because this new Disney movie, Turning Red, is out, which for anyone who hasn't seen it yet is about a little girl who turns into a red panda when she gets excited. But the theme of the movie is actually about puberty and coming of age and changing physically, I suppose. It's actually a really bloody clever way of doing it. Like, I think it's great. But there's really amazing representation in it. There's periods, there's pads. Imagine, in a Disney movie. Like, it's about time. And for the most part, we on Her Family are seeing like a brilliant reaction to it. Families are delighted that it's being... it's just a part of life. Why wouldn't it be in this cartoon? But we have seen a bit of pushback as well from parents who say, well, I don't want to have to explain that now, and my kids are watching this. And my question is, why? Why do you not want to explain that? But, it's really important that stuff like that is happening, because it's just becoming just a standard as seeing a roll of toilet roll in the toilet. It's just another thing that you use when you go to the bathroom. Well, that's what I think. How important is that, that periods are just normalised?
I think it's incredibly important if you want to build connection with your kids as they grow.
Yeah.
Like and I'm going to sort of do a little bit of like real talk now. If we are prioritising our own sense of comfort over our ability to prepare our child for whatever may come and show them that they can come and talk to us about anything. So if we're prioritising our own feelings of comfort over that, then, it's sort of like some questions need to be asked. And that might sound a bit harsh, but I think sometimes we don't realise that when we're choosing to wait to talk, we're actually making a decision to leave our child open to hearing something before we get to it. And they could hear it from someone at school or another adult who doesn't share our values. And every time we start a conversation earlier, we are reinforcing to our child that I am the person that you can come to about anything.
Yes.
And I remember, my kids are teens now, but I remember one of my kids sending me a text message to talk about a breakup that they were experiencing. And teens don't do that unless you have proven yourself someone that is a safe space to hold really complex and difficult life experiences, and that you're comfortable with the awkwardness and the pain and the sorrow and the hurt of real life. And so when we aren't able to deal with the anxiety and the worry about watching a Disney movie that has a pad or a tampon in it, then that's a sign of things to come, that we're not going to have proved ourselves to be comfortable to talk about really difficult emotions, not just in our life, but in our child's life. And I know most everyone watching this is not going to want their teen to be dealing with complex things without their help. And I think it's just a matter of getting clear and teasing apart, like the actions that we take when our kids are younger, they have an impact on later on when the stakes are much higher, and nobody wants that for their child. No one does.
In fact, that leads me on to the next kind of question I had, really, was that I feel like, we're talking about periods and sex as these kind of educational pieces where we learn about what's going to happen and how it might feel and all of that, but really it's about learning about your own body. Like, it is actually teaching a child about how they may feel, what will happen. Like, it's such a, it's keeping that from them is wrong when you think about it. Like, it's about them. You can't keep that secret from them. And if they're growing up and they feel comfortable with themselves and they're sort of in touch with their body in the sense that they know how it feels, they know what feels good, what doesn't, it really does set up, the conversation for the wider consent piece, doesn't it? About how if something feels good, then you might want to do it. If it doesn't feel good, then you can say no, all of those things. It's a big part of it, isn't it, there?
It is, and I think in our families we have amazing opportunities to model what consent feels like.
Yeah.
So consent is not just about knowing what we want and speaking up for it, or knowing what feels good and speaking up for it, but it's also about what does it feel like when someone is saying no to what we want. And that tension of being refused something, that plays out in family life all the time. And one of the dynamics we talk about a lot in the Evolve School in my world is as mothers, oftentimes we're socialized to sacrifice a lot in our family for the sake of our kids. And that has a consent implication, because if our children don't have the opportunity to hear no, and it's not working for me today, or whatever, we're denying them the chance to develop the skill of being good with someone's no. And that's important for kids of every gender, but particularly kids who are very forceful and are used to getting what they want. They have no problems advocating for themselves. Those are the kids that really need to be schooled in what no can feel like and how actually hard it can feel sometimes.
Of course, you deal with kind of maybe slightly older kids as well. Consent isn't a word that I would have even heard growing up, so it's just so good that the conversations are happening in the broader context of just general, consent, but also in a sexual way. So do you think kids have a really good understanding about consent?
I think they want to, which is good. But they find it a bit scary. Like, the teenagers that I'm working with find it a bit scary. Yeah. Like, a lot of programs are, like sex and the law. Like, that's kind of the way the consent is framed. And basically, like, if you do this, this is what will happen in terms of the law, So it comes in as this big scary concept. But, something we've kind of tried to develop, I suppose, through sex education programs is that consent, like Sarah said, is happening in your everyday life.
Yes.
Like, so what we would try to do is apply it to like an everyday example, like, can I borrow your coat, whatever it is, and then they will find it easier then to apply it then when it is in a sexual private situation in a different context. So yeah, the consent thing I do find can be quite heavy and serious, and it is. Yeah. But if we want to get young people into these programs, taking in the information and enjoying themselves while learning, then we need to kind of look at it in a way that's more that they can apply better.
Sure. Yeah. And so in a home setting, how would you approach talking to a child about consent, and like at what age is appropriate? Because obviously it does bring up the negative ends of, consent.
Yeah. Well, I'm only dealing with an 18-month-old at the moment who's having very big tantrums.
My child does not understand no, I can tell you that. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, he knows how to say it. But anyway.
Oh, we haven't learned how to say it yet, actually, which is good.
It's coming.
Yeah. But in the home setting, I suppose, like what Sarah's saying there, I think just each person is an advocate for themselves and is equal, I suppose. You gave a really good example of that before about watching the telly. Do you remember?
I don't remember that, but I certainly know play dates give a really good opportunity for a parent to start talking or creating a narrative like they do in rugby. They say, and now this is happening, and now this is happening. Well, you can do that in play dates too. If you see kids that someone is sort of riding roughshod over someone else's needs, you can step in and go, I'm noticing that Billy is saying he doesn't want to play and you are still making him play. That must be really hard for Billy. You know, well, how can we make a decision that everyone wants to do? And you sort of facilitate it in that way by creating safety and helping to amplify the child's voice that is having trouble being heard and giving the more forceful child pause so they can really think about what's going on. And there are dynamics like that happen in our lives over and over again. I had a party, I think it was a 10-year-old party, and they wanted to play a game of like who could eat the most mustard out of the tube, and it was like the consent implications of that, because there's all this peer pressure around like I can eat more mustard than you, and you're seeing some of the kids going, I really don't want to eat it, but I'm just going to squeeze the tube, and I'm like, oh. And so like parenting, it's not easy, and there are grey areas, and I think the way I managed that was, well, I feel uncomfortable, everyone, about the fact that people feel under pressure to eat the mustard, and everyone's going, yeah, it's fine, but at least I said it, you know, and as long as there's an adult that is sort of pointing things out, I think
they're hearing it, even if they're not listening.
That's right.
Yeah. That's like every game of dares, isn't it?
Yeah.
Doing something that you don't want to do.
Yeah.
And of course, the bad side of that is that you know, you see all these memes about you teach your kids to be like, you know, like feminists and everything, and then they say things to you like my body, my choice when they don't have a shower, you know, like so it can backfire on you. But you know, that's really good way of kind of introducing consent as a you know, a wider topic or whatever from the home. I mean, at what point is it okay to get into the nitty gritty of consent, I suppose, and what that might mean in a sexual context later on? What age do you think is appropriate?
Yeah, I'm thinking.
I guess.
Well, no, I actually don't think child-led. It's this idea of child-led is super interesting, because where else in our parenting do we wait for our child to ask for something that's important for their safety? Like my children never asked me to put the seatbelt on when they're in the car, but I did that every single trip because I knew how important it was, right? So when it comes to consent, and when you're talking about things related to sexual consent, then I'm thinking 7 and 8. That would be the time where you can really start laying the foundation. And remember, these conversations, they're not one conversation, Laura, right? We're layering things on over time. And so we're talking about having a conversation about sexual consent, but right back at the beginning, when our child is 2 and 3 and 4, we're layering on normal everyday consent. So when it comes to consent related to, you know, sharing your body with someone else, we don't have to do all the groundwork. And in fact, you know, children as young as 4 and 3, we're talking about body autonomy, which is part of the consent conversation, like that your genitals are yours, no one else gets to touch them, you get to choose what happens to them. Sometimes, because you might get sick, you will need the help of a grown-up, and we will explain why that's happening, but there is never any secrets around, you know, what we call private parts. You know, you can use private parts, but accurate names for body parts are best. So you notice that question about consent, actually, it reminds us that this is everything is a layered conversation, and we're creating mini conversations week on, week off for the years of our children's life as they grow.
I'll give you an example of how not to do it. And I'm really showing my age now, but the day I learned what sex was, physically how it happened, was because I'd seen something on the television that I didn't understand. And what I'd seen on the TV was an episode of a programme called Cagney and Lacey, which most of you won't remember because you're probably not as geriatric as me, where there was a sexual assault. And I was not supposed to see that. But I then had to go and ask the question. So I learned what sex was and what rape was on the same day because of something I'd seen. But that's like, you know, how could that not, you know...
Such a negative connection.
Oh my God, it's such a negative connection, you know. So that's... You know, like you say about parents, I'm hell-bent on trying to do it the right way, because it certainly wasn't the right way for me.
Yeah. You know what, the complexity is that as families, like Anna has said about how the sex education in Ireland, it's more could be done. And that's all very well. We're all used to working within broken systems. But the complexity for families is that if the work isn't spread over, you know, the media, the youth club, the school, then the unfair burden falls on families. And we are all busy. We're all trying to make ends meet. We've got health issues. And then to be the sex educator for our kids, which we do have to be, but also take on the burden of all the other areas of life where sex education could happen. That's really a tall order. And so it would make sense if, you know, people are listening to this conversation, watching this conversation and feeling like, I simply cannot take on another thing.
Another thing, yeah, exactly. And Sarah mentioned there are youth clubs. Like, I'm working as a youth worker at the moment, and like that, every young person we have coming in the door, we ask them, like, you know, are you getting sex ed in school? Are you comfortable talking to people at home about it? And if not, like, we'll do a program here. So it is kind of being picked up in different places as well. But like that's a really good example. Like, it needs to be spread. It needs to be spread. Like the home life is brilliant. And like you say, being comfortable talking to your parents is great. But you might get to a stage, like as a teenager, where you go, I don't actually want my mum to know about that part of my life. So, and it comes to peers and socialising and everything. So there might need to be someone else, you know, and that could be a teacher or a youth worker or some other trusted adult, you know.
It's all developing at a different stage, obviously, but it's the kind of the whole picture, really, is the whole circle. Can I just ask, and we're running out of time, unfortunately, but how important is using the correct terminology for body parts?
Yeah, so this is a funny one for me. So, like, as a sex educator, obviously I have no problem using the correct words, and I do in my work completely. But with my child at home, I just use one different word. Like, I don't use the word penis, and I don't know why that is.
Well, I'm the same. You know, I think he's 21 months at this stage, and like he calls it his willy.
Yeah, I use willy as well. Yeah.
And like in time, I do plan to teach him penis, vulva, all of those things. But at the moment, if I'm getting dressed, he shouts boobies at me. He's a toddler, though, it's fine, I think, for now. But, you know, as they go on, it is important to teach them the correct words, I guess, is it?
Yeah,
I don't think we can beat ourselves up with that.
Yeah. I definitely think it's important, and I understand why, in terms of, you know, if anything bad happened, and being able to describe exactly what happened and for there to be no mix-ups or anything like that. So I do understand definitely the importance of it. But I don't know, just for me at the moment, maybe going forward, I think we'll have set words. Yes. And then that'll be the clear descriptor for us.
Yeah, and I think there's other analogies about this same dynamic we're talking about in parenting. So I think about table manners. Like, we teach our child table manners. We have a set sort of table manners for if we go to Nana's, for example, and she's giving us soup for lunch and we sit at the table and use our spoon. We've got different manners for if we go on a picnic and we're eating with our hands and we're sitting on a rug and we're running around the park. Well, the same thing applies to genital words, right? That there are some instances where we need to know penis and vulva. Like we're going to the doctors, or we need to talk to our parent about something going wrong. But if we're in the schoolyard and we say penis and vulva, we are going to get bullied and told we're like, what? Who the hell do you think you are, sort of thing. So it's just, there's so many different dynamics in the world where some behaviours are appropriate for some instances and others for others. And this is just another example.
We need to give them more credit, really, that they can understand nuance at a certain point.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's just making me think then as well, like, that if you used willy in a like sexual situation
at the hospital, like, with a better problem. Maybe you and I have a bit of work still to do.
Exactly.
Guys, I'm afraid that's all we have time for, so we're going to have to leave it there. But I could have talked about this all day. I think it's going to be really helpful and hopefully embolden a few parents who are coming into that point where they have to start having these conversations with their kids, and just for all of us to remember that it's just sex, it's just periods, just like anything else. And, you know, there's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't just talk about them like we were talking about a movie. That's all we have time for, I'm afraid. As usual, I will leave all the details of the ladies and everything we've spoken about below the video. Until next week, mind yourselves.